So hi everyone, thanks for joining. We are going to start shortly. So before we start, just please be aware that we are going to record this webinar. And when you have a question, you will find a short Q&A button in the bottom corner of your Zoom client. So feel free to ask any question you want. And when you want to talk to us, just raise your hand and then we are able to unmute your microphone and then you are able to talk, but please be aware that then everybody else is able to see your name as long as you are going to talk. So that's beforehand, and now we are going to start. So welcome to our joint webinar with TEAL and SpecterOps about securing your on-prem and cloud infrastructure with tools from SpecterOps and our approach from TEAL. So I'm happy to see all of you here. And yeah, let's start with the quick introduction and agenda. So please go to the next slide, Jonas. So we first introduce ourselves very briefly, and then we dig into the details and want to present to you how you are going to secure your on-prem and cloud infrastructure with the tools that is SpecterOps providing and approach that we are offering from the TEAL side. We also prepared some BloodHound Enterprise demos for you, and then at the end of the session we will do our Q&A session. So please go 2 slides ahead so that we so who is talking to you? I have Jonas with me. Jonas is a technical account manager at SpecterOps. So SpecterOps is probably well known on your side. Publisher of BloodHound Community Edition and also BloodHound Enterprise. So feel free to reach out to the SpecterOps website or to the LinkedIn profile of Jonas. And I'm Fabian Böhm. I'm a security architect at TEAL. TEAL is a consulting company based in Germany. And we are specialized in securing on-prem and cloud infrastructures in the Microsoft ecosystem. So also feel free to add me in LinkedIn and reach out to me. So on the next slide, we have one slide prepared why we are doing this webinar together, and that's because we announced a partnership between SpecterOps and TEAL a couple of weeks ago. So why did we do that? We did that because we thought we can combine our strengths in the 2 companies. So SpecterOps is obviously quite familiar and experts in advisory tactics and in the mindset, have a great product knowledge and also great product know-how. And of course, they also have seen a lot of environments at the customer side and are very deep dive experience with security configuration in Active Directory and Azure. And on the other hand, we from TEAL, we do projects for many, many years. Even if the company is founded in 2017, we are all quite experienced and have done multiple projects, big projects, international projects, and our strength is to do end-to-end project management, but also technical implementation together with our customers to increase their security knowledge and also to increase their security level. And beside that, you will also benefit from a couple of other things. So first of all, mostly EU-based companies maybe want to consume SpecterOps services and paying in euro instead of dollar. So you could avoid this currency risk if you work together with us. And also all of the contracts are with us from TEAL and not with a US-based company, which is, at least in Germany, where we are from, quite a hard requirement, but also in other EU-based countries. In addition to that, you probably are also be more convenient with the time zone. So when we are in the same time zone, it's easier to do meetings and also do trials together, troubleshooting, instead of one of the participants must be in the call in the middle of the night. And what is also possible, also quite important for our Europe-based companies, is that you can decide where your data is going to be hosted. So SpecterOps is hosting BloodHound Enterprise in AWS, also in Frankfurt, Germany, and in London, England, instead of the US. Of course, you could also use a data center in the US, but at least for the most of EU-based companies, London or Frankfurt would be the choice here. So that's in total why we did the partnership, and we are really happy that we have done that, and looking forward to many BloodHound Enterprise projects together in the future. So on the next slides, we want to dig into the details and present our approach, what we believe is a good strategy to secure your infrastructure. And to start from the very top on the next slide, I think it's quite common, and all of you may be reading some different articles every day. And yeah, every week there are more companies affected by a cyber attack, and the damage is sometimes quite dramatically. And therefore, we think that at some point in time, you will face a successful cyber attack. So therefore, your effort should be more related to reduce the impact of a successful attack, instead of trying to avoid an attack at all, because at some point in time you probably be a victim of a cyber attack. And to reduce the impact of a successful attack, we think that you should protect your identities and your infrastructure based on four pillars that you need to work on. So first of all, you need to understand how adversaries are going to think. So SpecterOps is also using the claim attackers think in graphs, defenders think in lists. And you need to be aware of the tactics and the tools that an attacker is going to use in order to find the correct countermeasures to mitigate the findings. And one pillar where we look at quite closely in this webinar is the tiering model from the Microsoft ESE framework. So I will guide you through that in just a minute. So this is really a foundation where you classify your systems and find out what are the most critical systems you need to protect. And then once you have identified your critical systems, you should layer your defense and assign or implement several organizational and technical controls to increase your security level based on the defined tier class. So the most critical systems obviously have the most controls applied to it and need to be secured more closely than not so important systems. And then once you have done that, you need to start a continuously improvement process, because attackers also evolve and adapt their steps. There are new attack paths out there from time to time, and you need to be aware of that and train your operation team to have a long-term success in securing your infrastructure. So those are the four main pillars from our point of view. And on the next slide, we also collected some of questions we see at almost all of our customers. So basically, when we start a project, we observed sometime the situation that the client thinks, okay, Active Directory is my central identity system where I'm going to assign permissions and control my users. And maybe I start with securing just the domain controllers. But we state every time that this is not enough. We live in a hybrid world, so probably you have some cloud services in use or some other critical applications which must be secured as well. And also some non-technical questions must be answered. For example, who is going to train my admin team, or do I give them time to read blog articles or attend at a webinar such as you are doing now? So you should be aware of those questions as well, and maybe develop a training plan for your admin team and say, okay, from time to time they will have time to read a blog article, do some testing, etc. But also who is going to operate my critical system. So maybe I have a sourcing strategy where I source all of the services to another company. And maybe it's an idea to think about that and define that the most critical assets are controlled only by my internal admin team, and the not so critical systems are sourced to a service provider doing the work for me. And also what happens when I'm going to apply some hardening to my application servers? Does the application still work and is functional, or do we need to talk to the publisher of this specific application to maybe have a new version of the application before we can harden the server underneath it? And same goes for backup, patch management, and so on. And basically, the answer to all of those questions is in a hybrid world, on the one hand side, the enhanced secure admin environment from Microsoft, which is basically a best practice framework on how to secure your on-prem infrastructure. And this approach also evolved into the enterprise access model, which is aiming more to secure your infrastructure in the cloud as well. So those two models can help you to manage your hybrid world securely. That's how we stated it. And on the next slide, maybe you are aware of that Microsoft retired ECE a couple of years ago, but there are still some use cases. Microsoft is stating that as well, where we have still valid use cases where ECE is still the way to go. So for example, what are you going to do if you are not allowed to use cloud services and have a pretty isolated environment? Then you still have Active Directory and not Azure or other cloud services to protect your infrastructure. So you need to stick to ECE here again. Or you have maybe other reasons, for example, regulated environments where you are not allowed to discontinue your Active Directory on-prem and go to the cloud only. So this is also quite common in critical infrastructure companies, or maybe also in combination with security assurance. It's maybe also mandated to still use on-prem services. And what is not written here, but also quite common, is that you are simply not quick enough to turn off all your old infrastructure on-prem and be a cloud-only company. The larger the company, the more difficult it is to get rid of all of the old on-prem systems. We also wrote quite a long blog article about that. So if you're interested in more details about that, feel free to reach out to our blog and read that. And if you have questions, of course, you can also reach out to us. So let's look a bit deeper into the tiering model, which I said before is one of the key principles in the ECE framework. So what is the tiering model? The idea of the tiering model is to classify your systems into different layers and create several buffer zones between them to make sure that when an attacker is, for example, hacking an end user device, that the attacker is not able to quickly reach out to all of our critical assets and take over the whole environment, but is stuck to probably the end user layer. And Microsoft is here talking about three layers, which are called Tier 0, Tier 1, and Tier 2, where Tier 0 are the most critical assets. So, for example, domain controllers, PKI systems, other identity systems, federation services, etc., but maybe also a critical business application which must be secured. And Tier 1 systems are most probably server systems, which must be also, of course, protected, but maybe not with the same measures than the Tier 0 system. And then, last but not least, all of the end user devices, such as mobile phones, laptops, workstations, etc., printers, are classified normally as Tier 2. And we from TEAL do normally, together with our clients, some sort of a risk-based approach to define which systems are going to be Tier 0 and Tier 1. And we use a decision tree for that, where we analyze each of the system individually, ask several questions, and then at the end of the day, decide in which tier the system belongs. And once we have done that, we can move on to the second phase, which is then that we need to ensure that a lower tier cannot control a higher tier. So what does that mean? So to give you a quick example, if you have, for example, a WSUS server doing patch management, but this system is classified as Tier 1, then it wouldn't be allowed to patch also Tier 0 system from this WSUS instance, because the security measures are not that restricted than in Tier 0 world. So that's the rationale behind that. On the other way around, what is allowed is that you can control with a WSUS server in Tier 0, you can control a system in Tier 1 or Tier 2, because then the protection level of the Tier 0 system is already at its best. So that is the next thing you need to ensure. And normally you are going to either duplicate some of your management infrastructure, such as backup system, monitoring, patch management, or you're going to implement other approaches to do the same task. So one quick example is a backup process of a domain controller can be done, for example, with Windows-based things, and do a system state backup and encrypt this backup in a BitLocker protected container, for example, and only back up this encrypted container with your normal backup software. So then you still have a protected backup, but use the same backup methodology to protect your Tier 0 assets. Or the other way around, you of course could also install a dedicated instance of your backup software only for Tier 0. And last but not least, what you also need to do is that you finish your account separation and implement log-on restrictions, which mean that, for example, when Jonas is our Tier 0 administrator, but has also something to do in the Tier 1 or Tier 2 world, he would need a dedicated account for each of this administration layer. So which means a dedicated account for Tier 0, dedicated account for Tier 1, and maybe also for Tier 2. And we must ensure that his Tier 0 account is not used on a Tier 1 or Tier 2 systems, in order to not leave any credentials there, which then could be used by an attacker with a Mimikatz attack or something else. So pass the ticket, pass the hash attack. And there we normally go and implement the account separation and also some group policies to simply avoid interactive log on and restrict that to tier 0 systems only. So those are the 3 phases which are used to build quite a good foundation to implement a tiering model in an on-prem world. But as I mentioned before, we live in a hybrid world, so we need to look into the cloud world as well. And Jonas is now going to look into the cloud model.
Yeah, so this is the enterprise access model that was published by Microsoft in December 2020. And it's a more generic model as it aims to cover both on-premise AD, but also cloud services such as Azure and AWS, and also OT environments. Now let's try to take a closer look at what it actually contains. The first thing I would like to talk about is the data workload plane, which is the green field here in the middle. And it is where you have your business applications and business processes that the normal employees of the company interact with to do their daily job. So the normal users, they access these applications through an interface down here in the user access, which is down in the bottom here. And the users, of course, has a user account and a user device from where they connected to this interface. Then there can be one or more intermediaries, and that could be, for example, let's say that that we have a web application where the employees store customer data and modify this data. Then there could be a VPN solution that allows these users to access this web application from home. It could also be a PAM solution, this intermediary. Then we also have app access. So if the application exposes an API, then other apps can access this data through the API, and that's the app access just right to the user access. And then there's also the internal app access. Now, all the light blue arrows here represent the tier 2 of the classic AD tier model Microsoft states. So some users may have higher privileges in the apps and the business process and all the workloads. And these users with higher privileges, it could be, for example, in the case of the web app, it would be the privilege to delete all data for a given customer. These users should access the data workload plane from this privilege access up in the top here. So that will require the account or the employee to have a separate account and a separate device from where they log into this interface of the data workload plane. Then we also have roles such as like web admins that has control over the web application on another level, and they will connect to the management plane where they can stop the service and update it and patch it and so on. And this access to the management plane and data workload plane through the privilege access is what Microsoft says is the equivalent of the tier 1 in the classic AD tier model. Last but not least, we have the control plane, which is where you have full control over all the identities and assets in the organization. So in on-premise AD, that will of course be groups like domain admins, and in Azure, it will be roles like global admin. And access to the control plane should also go through privileged access up here. Now, it's not very clear from the model itself, but there's also a principle of control restrictions, just like in the AD tier model. So that means that you cannot control a plane higher up than the one you're in. So for example, you should not be able to go to the management plane and then control assets of the control plane, just like you don't have the ability to control tier 0 assets from tier 1 in the AD tier model. Now, Microsoft has released a lot of documents regarding their privilege, how they think privilege access should be done. And one of the things is this privilege access strategy, which is highly related to the enterprise access model. And here we can see that it's very clear that the user access and privilege access should be completely separated, such that it's not possible if a user gets compromised, a regular user, through, let's say, phishing, they should not have the ability to compromise privileged users. So that means that an employee with both a normal user, which almost every employee will have, should have 2 accounts. So they should both have like a user account for doing emailing, web browsing, and so on. And then they need a separate account for privileged access. And they should only use this from a dedicated device or workstation for this privileged access. Microsoft also says that privileged access should be secured more tightly than normal user access. So that means that the privileged access should have a device that is hardened, and they should be prompted for MFA when they log on to an interface, and they should also use things like just-in-time administration. And the concept is the more privileged the user is, the more stricter the security should be. Now, the difference between Microsoft's old recommendation for on-premise and the newer one here with the enterprise access model is that the old were more focused on preventing attacks that involved cached credentials, because it's a big security challenge in on-premise. And the newer one here are more focused on Azure technologies that are available, such as Azure conditional access. But the core principles are very much the same. Now, all this may seem like a lot to implement in an enterprise, but it is doable. It may take time if you start from scratch, but as you improve over the years, then you will slowly decrease the risk of compromising of your infrastructure, be completely compromised when the attackers gain initial access. And you will be better off than the companies that don't do anything about it. So for the rest of this webinar, Fabian and I will talk about how TEAL and BloodHound Enterprise can help you on this journey.
Thanks, Jonas. So when we look at a typical customer journey, as Jonas mentioned, we want to introduce our approach on the next slide. So typically, when a customer comes to us, we normally start with a standardized security assessment, where we have basically 3 different phases before we are going to implement the measures we defined. And what is quite important from our point of view, as mentioned before, is that we know how attackers would act and what tool stack we have to respond to those activities. So that's why in our 3-day assessment, we are spending 1 complete day in just preparation and know-how transfer, where we are going to demonstrate what are the tools an attacker is using. So how is a Mimikatz attack working? How can I use BloodHound Community Edition and BloodHound Enterprise to find attack paths in my environment? And what are the different measures to respond to the activities, so that you have a solid understanding of the possibilities you have to respond. And then afterwards, where BloodHound Enterprise is quite a huge part of it, but also not the only one. We have a tool stack where we are going to your environment and execute a wrapper tool and find or execute several things and do stuff like test your password quality. We do some attack path analysis in BloodHound Enterprise. We check the patch management status. We have a dedicated questionnaire, etc. All aiming with the goal to understand your operational processes, your challenges, and also to get familiar with your environment. And then we take that data and going to analyze that offline in a secure environment and obviously delete it afterwards, and going to define some activities or measures we would recommend to implement and put that all together in a roadmap and come back to you, talk to you about it, and then define a roadmap which you can either implement on your own or, of course, also together with our help. And then you have the foundation to start a continuously improvement where you first implement a solid foundation and then start an iterative process, as Jonas mentioned, where you get better from time to time over the years and also respond to new attack paths. But as soon as you have built a foundation, you can also dig into more sophisticated stuff like CM use cases, etc. But before, you need to make sure that you have a solid patch level, that you don't have non-hardened systems where SMB version 1 protocols are allowed, etc. So that must be done first. And obviously, you also need to mitigate the most common findings we see always in the different environments. And that's where, again, BloodHound Enterprise comes in, where you can visualize the attack path and also get recommendations on how to mitigate things. And now we are close to our first demo, and Jonas will take you there and demonstrate how BloodHound Enterprise is going to help you in this scenario.
Yeah, so BloodHound Enterprise is an attack path management tool. And before I show you the tool, I would like to go through what is it that I mean when I say attack path exactly. And we'll do that by going through a simple breach narrative. So it's a very generic example of what could happen in an actual incident. So it may sound somewhat familiar to a recent penetration test or incident response. We'll start out with our user, David here, and he is compromised through phishing. Now, David is not a very privileged user in our environment. He's not a domain admin or anything, but he is a member of the help desk group. And help desk is member of tier 2 support. Now, this is very common in on-premise Active Directory to have this group nesting, but it can accidentally overprivilege the underlying members by hiding the effective permissions. Tier 2 support has local admin rights on this computer called Payment 01. So when David's user is compromised, this malicious actor has now local admin's rights on the system. On the system, there's a service account logged in. So now the attacker can use a tool like Mimikatz to dump the credentials of this service account and act on its behalf. Unfortunately, in this domain, this service account has the privilege to add members to domain admins, meaning that the attackers now have full control over the environment. So even though that David is not a privileged user in this environment, there exist configurations that enables this attack path through the environment to gain full control. And this is just one example of an attack path. But in big enterprise environments, there are millions of attack paths of different security levels and severity. Now, and these attack paths don't form because of negligence from the AD administration team. The reality is that the implications of configurations and changes in Active Directory is not very clear. And there's so much opportunity for these attack paths to build up over time, especially if your AD environment has been running for a while. You will have different admin teams come and go, and they will install software, remove software, and do a lot of changes in the environment, which will form these unintended paths. BloodHound Enterprise was built exactly to combat this problem of attack paths. Now, the open source version that was released 6 years ago was made to make it easier for penetration testers to find attack paths like this one. You can see it as the open source version, like Google Maps for Active Directory. It can help you to get from A to B, or find an attack path like this one from David to domain admins, or several attack paths like this one. But as a security defender or AD admin, an attack path like this is not very interesting on its own. You would like to know all the attack paths to domain admins from any user in the environment, and not just the attack paths to domain admins, but all the critical assets of Active Directory or Azure. So that would be tier 0 or the control plane, as we talked about before in the AD tier model and the enterprise access model. So assets like domain admins, enterprise admins, backup operators, and in Azure there will be global admins, for example. Now in BloodHound Enterprise, we help you set up this set of critical assets in what we call tier 0. And then we map out all the attack paths throughout the configurations and relationships that leads to these critical assets. Then identify the choke points of privilege that allow compromise of these tier 0 assets. The reality is that each of these arrows here, they represent an abusable privilege that an attacker could use to compromise objects in your infrastructure. But rather than address each of them, we want to focus on the choke points at the top and completely remediate the downstream risk of the attack paths below it. We then quantify the exposure of each choke point, such that you could say that 92% of the users in this domain has the ability to compromise tier 0 through this choke point. And this is where you should start your remediation first. Now, I want to show you my demo environment. So I'll just change what I'm sharing here to this screen. I hope you can see my demo environment here.
Yes, it's working.
Great. So this is the main interface of BloodHound Enterprise. And you may see that it looks somewhat familiar to the slides that I just showed you. So up here we have our critical assets, or tier 0 as we call it. Now this is an on-premise domain. So here I have the domain object, and some of the built-in groups is what we start off with, like administrators, backup operators, domain admins, etc. And when we deploy it, we also add custom things like Fabian also mentioned before, that PKI infrastructure and ADFS, also PAM solutions like CyberArk and such. So all the assets that belong to tier 0 and give full control over the environment. Now, and when we have that set, BloodHound Enterprise will automatically find all the attack paths that leads to tier 0 in the environment and create this big attack graph. But what we really should focus on is the choke points up here, as that will allow us to mediate most risk with the fewest number of changes. Now let's try to take a look at this one here. So this one is bold and it's purple and has this critical tag to it. And this severity is based on how many percentage of the environment that can compromise tier 0 through this exact attack path. And critical means that 95 to 100% of the users in the environment can abuse this attack path. We also provide a description here that states what it is and how it was formed and how attackers can abuse it. And this particular attack path here is when a tier 0 user is logging into a non-tier 0 computer and thereby exposing their credentials. Down here, we can see the tier 0 users and the computers that they log into. And if you click here on timeline, we can see the history of this attack path. And we can see if it's a decreasing or increasing problem. And if we want to dig more into like what is going on here, we can also click on this Explore button here. And we get to an interface that's very similar to the open source version of BloodHound, if you've ever used that. Here we can see that this is one of the tier 0 users logging into a non-tier 0 computer. If we click on this, we can see there's a lot of inbound execution privileges on this computer. And we can see that it's RDP user access. And let's just try one of them. And we can see that it turns out that domain users has RDP access to this computer, where a tier 0 user has a session. So that is why the exposure percentage is so high. Now we actually want to remediate the attack path, or this particular attack path. And what we will do now is to go down here to remediation, where we can see what it involves to remediate this problem. And we can see the full remediation guide here, which is a step-by-step procedure on how to actually fix the issue. And it may involve deploying a GPO like this one. It could also be changing the permission of a specific object. But in these cases, there will be detailed description for the given attack path. We also have some more technical background on the side here and reference to MITRE ATT&CK and how attackers abuse this attack path. So yeah, and now I want to give the talk back to you, Fabian.
Yes.
If I can figure out to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So what I want to outline is, as I said before, when we do our standardized assessment, one major part is that we execute several tools in your environment, which is BloodHound Enterprise also part of. But also we have, as I said, a questionnaire and several other tools. For example, we also test the security of your PKI systems also with another interesting tool stack published and described also by SpecterOps. So we have several tools in our assessment. And then when we have analyzed and evaluated all the questionnaire questions and the findings, we are going to do a risk-based approach to identify the most critical findings, because we also, like in BloodHound Enterprise, want to focus on the most critical ones first. So we have 4 different categories in our risk approach. So you will see in the screenshot in the middle an example of a heat map here. And then obviously you would look into the most critical one first. And normally in the most environments, mitigating the most critical BloodHound Enterprise finding is also on the top of the list, so in category A in this case, as for example, thinking about how my RDP permissions are assigned to my end users, because probably not everybody needs to log on to every system. But also beside on that, what was quite good to see in this example is that as soon as the domain admin account is not logging into this system anymore and instead is using a PAW device, for example, then this attack path would be solved as well, even without changing the RDP configuration. So this is a perfect example where it makes sense to think about a tiering model, for example. And then we classify all of the different findings. So we have quite above 50 measures we are going to evaluate here, and then present that to you. Each of the finding has a recommendation how to mitigate this specific finding in your environment. And then last but not least, we also put that in a roadmap together, depending on your budget, on the time you need to spend, on the manpower you have to work on that, and also the criticality, what we have found. And then we normally build 3 to 4 different phases where we are going to set a baseline and then get better over time and use BloodHound Enterprise as a continuous monitoring instance to verify, is that what I have implemented really increasing my security level? So, and then after you have implemented all the short and midterm findings and mitigations, it's a good point where you say, okay, now I've built a foundation, and now you should reevaluate if you are still need to adjust some things and what your security level is. And here again, BloodHound Enterprise is quite a good tool. And I think, Jonas, you're going to demonstrate now how a typical environment is looking after we are going to mitigate the most critical findings.
Yeah, that I will. So what I showed before was obviously a on-premise AD environment, but we also have Azure. And here we have an Azure environment where we have actually remediated many of the high risk and critical findings here. So you can see that the Azure interface is exactly the same as the on-premise. It's just different names, different attack paths. And if you click up here, see that we have roles instead of some of the on-premise stuff. But here we can see on the posture page here that if I change this to go back in time here, here we measure the overall exposure of the entire domain, or in this case, Azure tenant. So that would be the percentage of the users and computers in the environment that can compromise tier 0. And we can see that we started off here with 98% of the environment that was exposed to the non-tier 0. And then we have remediated some of the attack paths, and this graph shows that how this what the implication has been for the environment. So we can use that to go to management and state that because of the remediation we have performed, we have actually reduced the risk of our critical assets to be compromised quite significantly. And yeah, that is the different pieces of BloodHound Enterprise. We will show you, we'll find the attack paths, and we will figure out how bad they are for your environment, so the exposure percentage, and then we'll give you an remediation plan for how to fix these attack paths, and then we measure this exposure percentage for the overall domain or Azure tenant over time, so you can monitor your environment and also spot if there's a new attack path that occurs in your environment because of misconfigurations, or if the exposure of one of the existing attack paths suddenly go up. So you can also use it for the longer run. And that was the last part of the demo. So I believe that was it. I think Fabian, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I forget to unmute myself. So yeah, so that was basically the content we like to share with you. So to sum it up, I think BloodHound Enterprise and also our assessment is quite a good way to start to improve your environment. So when you're interested into a free trial, feel free to reach out to us. Then we can talk about the trial period. As mentioned, we also published a blog post earlier today, so you can reach out our TEAL website or the SpecterOps website and read the blog article about that. And yeah, feel free to contact us. Our email address is info@teal-consulting.de, or use LinkedIn channel, so we will respond to that as well. And we will also send out a download link to the files later today, so that you are able to download the complete slide deck and yeah, dig into the details again. So now we want to start our Q&A session. So when you have any questions, just either raise your hand and then we will unmute you, or over the Q&A button, you can also send us a text message. Yeah, so one question was about the license model in BloodHound Enterprise. So basically, we have two options. So first of all, reach out to us and we can calculate the price. And the licensing fee is either for 1, 2, or 3 years, and is depending on the total number of employees or active users in your Active Directory. So just reach out to us and then we can calculate a price together and start a trial if you want to. And the assessment from our side, from TEAL side, is a fixed price where you can also get some information from our side. Yeah, another question was regarding the Azure feature, if this is already available to all customers. So Jonas, maybe you can say something about that.
Yes, it is. I believe it was made global availability, and then quite recently, but it is available to all customers.
Okay, great. I think this is really a huge improvement, that you not only can analyze your on-prem environment, but also your Azure environment, because as we know already that with an attack path from the cloud, you can also compromise your on-prem environment and vice versa. Then we have another question in regards to so how long do you think it typically take organizations to implement this tiering model? So from my experience, it's really depending on the size of your environment, but I would really recommend to start somewhere. It's still okay to start with a smaller set of tier 0 system and add other systems to the tier 0 layer later on, but you have started somewhere. And I think you could say you need probably a month or 2 to do some tiering classification and build an OU structure and start sorting assets into this new structure. And then it's really depending on how complex your application landscape is, because when you move the systems to the new OU structure, you obviously would also apply some hardening policies. You would need to implement log-on restriction policies, which is quite difficult depending on the application. But as Jonas also mentioned before, it's all doable. You just need to start somewhere. So I would say when you start with the tier 0 layer, you would need probably half a year or so to implement that, so that you can say, okay, now you have a good foundation where you can continuously improve the environment then afterwards. And the last question I see so far is, who is involved in the process for implementing tiering? I guess this is a more department question. So it's not only the Active Directory team, as it's depending on what you classify as tier 0 system, right? So and what we also learned from all of our customer engagement is that you need to make sure that you need to involve the ops team into that process, so that all of the people understand why we are going to do this, why is it going to be more complex than now, And the answer is quite simple, because we need to secure it. And you also need to involve your service desk and your main stakeholders application-wise, and to onboard them to the project as soon as possible. And then you will have great results. And I again recommend to start with a smaller set of tier 0 systems, and then reach out to tier 1, tier 2 securing afterwards. So I would say that. Anything you need to add, Jonas?
Yeah, I can say on the like how long does it take with the tiering. Yeah, but what we see most of the time when we deploy BloodHound Enterprise is that companies start up with an exposure of 70 to 100% to begin with. But there's usually also some things that you can fix rather quickly. So you can quite fast decrease the exposure percentage rapidly in the beginning. We've seen customers that have reduced it 20% just in the first week by changing like some. One example could be like the ownership of domain controllers. If the computer object has been created by a non-domain admin and then later been promoted to a domain controller, then the one that created the object will still be owner of the object. And changing that ownership has very little risk, or that has very little risk involved in changing that to domain admins, and that can, that can impact the exposure a lot. So but let's see, there's also a new question.
Yeah. So the question is, what are the most common risk problems while implementing the tiering model? Maybe I start again, and then you can add some things. So from my point of view, first of all, it's acceptance in your operations team, because it's not only a technical change you need to do. You need basically to think of how you are going to change your processes and the way you work. And it's really crucial to involve everybody who needs to work with this model afterwards, because otherwise nobody will use it then. If you don't understand something, you will not use it, and you will try to find side paths to avoid the more complex work. So this is from a non-technical side. And from a technical side, I would really say at the point where you move the tier 0 system to the new target OU and apply the hardening to it, and also define who is able to log on interactively, who is able to log on as a service, etc. This is a quite critical one, because some of the companies doesn't have a proper test environment where we can test all of the business applications. And when you not know 100% what permissions are required to run your application, then this is a critical one as well. And here testing, maybe also late hours, is quite good to avoid this risk of a failing application. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree on what you just said, Fabian. And another thing that also sometimes is a challenge is service accounts. As you also already mentioned, log-on permissions for service account can be troublesome. It's quite easy to create 2 accounts and tell an employee to use this account for these systems and use this account for the other systems. But it can be harder to tell that to a system if it doesn't support using different accounts for different tiers. So that could be a challenge there. But usually there's a solution for either by creating multiple instances or splitting up the permissions in some way.
Okay. So I don't see any more questions in the tab. So I think we're just finishing in time. So thanks for your participation, and we will send out the slide deck afterwards. The session is recorded. We're going to publish that in a couple of days as well. yeah, thanks for joining us, and yeah, have a nice day. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.